264 The China Study. Before leaving, I arranged for her to send me a copy of the memo she was referring to, and, in a day or so, she did. The memo had been sent from the office of the national president of the American Cancer Society, who also was a senior executive of the prestigious Roswell Park Memorial Institute for Cancer Research in Buffalo. This memo alleged that the scientific chair of the organization, without naming me, was heading up a group of 8 or 9 discredited physicians, several of whom had spent time in prison. It was total fabrication. I didn't even recognize the names of these discredited physicians and had no idea how something so vicious could have gotten started. After snooping around a little more, I discovered the person in the American Cancer Society office in Buffalo who was responsible for the memo. I phoned him. Not surprisingly, he was evasive and only said that he had gotten this information from an unnamed reporter. It was impossible to trace the original source. The one thing I do know for sure was that this memo was distributed by the office of the American Cancer Society's president. I also learned that the National Dairy Council, a powerful industry lobbying group, had obtained a copy of the same memo and proceeded to distribute a notice of its own to its local offices around the country. The smear campaign against the AICR was widespread. The food, pharmaceutical and medical industries through and/or parallel to the American Cancer Society and the National Dairy Council were showing their true colors. Prevention of cancer with low-cost, low-profit plant foods was not welcomed by the food and pharmaco-medical industries. With support from a trusting media, their combined power to influence the public was overwhelming. Personal consequences. The ending of this story, however, is a happy one. Although the AICR's first couple of years were turbulent and difficult for me both personally and professionally, the smear campaigns finally started to wane. No longer considered on the fringe, the AICR has now expanded to England. The World Cancer Research Fund, WCRF, in London and elsewhere. For over 20 years now, the AICR has run a program that funds research and education projects on the link between diet and cancer. I initially organized and chaired that grant program, and then continued as the AICR Senior Science Advisor for several years, in a few different stints, after its initial founding. Science the Dark Side 265. One more unfortunate affair, however, bears mention. I was informed by my Nutrition Society's board of directors that 2 society members, Bob Olson and Alf Harper, had proposed to have me expelled from the society, supposedly because of my association with the AICR. It would have been the first expulsion in the history of the society. I had to go to Washington to be interviewed by the president of the society and the director of nutrition at the FDA. Most of their questions concerned the AICR. The whole ordeal proved stranger than fiction. Expel a prominent society member shortly after I was nominated to be the organization's president for being involved with a cancer research organization. Later, I found myself reflecting on the whole ordeal with a colleague who knew the inner workings of our society, Professor Sam Tove of North Carolina State University. He, of course, knew all about the investigation, as well as other shenanigans. In our discussion, I told him about AICR being a worthy organization with good intentions. His response has resonated with me ever since. It's not about AICR, he said. It's about what you did on the National Academy of Sciences report on diet, nutrition and cancer. When the NAS's report concluded in June 1982 that a lower intake of fat and a higher intake of fruits, vegetables, and whole grain products would make for a healthier diet, I had betrayed, in the eyes of some, the nutrition research community. Supposedly, as one of the two diet and cancer experimental researchers on the panel, it was my job to protect the reputation of the American diet as it was. After my failure to do so, my subsequent involvement with the AICR and its promotion of the NAS report only made matters worse. Luckily, reason prevailed in this whole farcical encounter. A board meeting was held to vote on whether I should be expelled from my society, and I handily survived the vote, 6-0, with 2 abstentions. It was hard not to take all of this personally, but there's a larger point here, and it's not personal. In the world of nutrition and health, scientists are not free to pursue their research wherever it leads. Coming to the wrong conclusions, even through first-rate science, can damage your career. Trying to disseminate these wrong conclusions to the public, for the sake of public health, can destroy your career. Mine was not destroyed. I was lucky, and some good people stood up for me. But it could have gone much worse. After all of these numerous ordeals, I have a better understanding of 266 The China Study. Why my society did the things it did. The awards funded by Mead Johnson Nutritionals, Letterla Laboratories, Bioserve Biotechnologies and previously Procter & Gamble and the Dannon Institute, all food and drug outfits, represented a strange marriage between industry and my society. Point 8. Do you believe that these friends of the society are interested in pursuing scientific investigation, no matter what the conclusions may be? Consequences for the public. Ultimately, the lessons I learned in my career had little to do with specific names or specific institutions. These lessons have more to do with what goes on behind the scenes of any large institution. What happens behind the scenes during national policy discussions, whether it happens in scientific societies, the government, or in industry boardrooms, is supremely important for our health as a nation. The personal experiences I have talked about in this chapter, only a sample of such experiences, have consequences far greater than personal aggravation and damage to my career. These experiences illustrate the dark side of science, the side that harms not just individual researchers who get in the way, but all of society. It does this by systematically attempting to conceal, defeat, and destroy viewpoints that oppose the status quo. There are some people in very influential government and university positions who operate under the guise of being scientific experts, whose real jobs are to stifle open and honest scientific debate. Perhaps they receive significant personal compensation for attending to the interests of powerful food and drug companies, or perhaps they merely have an honest personal bias toward a company-friendly viewpoint. Personal bias is stronger than you may think. I know scientists with family members who died from cancer, and it angers them to entertain the possibility that personal choices, like diet, could have played a role in the death of their loved ones. Likewise, there are scientists for whom the high-fat, high-animal-based food diet they eat every day is simply what they learned was healthy at a young age. They love the habit, and they don't want to change. The vast majority of scientists are honorable, intelligent, and dedicated to the search for the common good rather than personal gain. However, there are a few scientists who are willing to sell their souls to the highest bidder. They may not be many in number, but their influence can be. Science: The Dark Side, 267. Vast. they can corrupt the good name of institutions of which they are a part, and, most importantly, they can create vast confusion among the public, which often cannot know who is who. You might turn on the TV one day to see an expert praising McDonald's hamburgers, and then read a magazine the same day that you should eat less high-fat red meat to protect yourself against cancer. Who is to be believed? Institutions also are part of the dark side of science. Committees like the Public Nutrition Information Committee and the American Council on Science and Health generate lopsided panels and committees and institutions that are far more interested in promoting their point of view than debating scientific research with an open mind. If a Public Nutrition Information Committee report says that low-fat diets are fraudulent scams, and a National Academy of Sciences report says the opposite, which one is right? In addition, this closed-mindedness in science spreads across entire systems. The American Cancer Society was not the only health institution that worked to make life difficult for the AICR. The National Cancer Institute Public Information Office, Harvard Medical School, and a few other universities with medical schools were highly skeptical of the AICR and, in some cases, outright hostile. The hostility of medical schools first surprised me, but when the American Cancer Society, a very traditional medical institution, also joined the fray, it became obvious that there really was a medical establishment. The behemoth did not take kindly to the idea of a serious connection between diet and cancer or, for that matter, virtually any other disease. Big medicine in America is in the business of treating disease with drugs and surgery after symptoms appear. This means that you might have turned on the TV to see that the American Cancer Society gives almost no credence to the idea that diet is linked to cancer, and then open the paper to see that the American Institute for Cancer Research says what you eat impacts your risk of getting cancer. Who do you trust? Only someone familiar with the inside of the system can distinguish between sincere positions based in science and insincere, self-serving positions. I was on the inside of the system for many years, working at the very top levels, and saw enough to be able to say that science is not always the honest search for truth that so many believe it to be. It far too often involves money, power, ego, and protection of personal interests above the common good. Very few, if any, illegal acts need to 268 the China study occur. It doesn't involve large payoffs being delivered to secret bank accounts or to private investigators in smoky hotel lobbies. It's not a Hollywood story, it's just day-to-day government, science, and industry. In the United States, scientific reductionism. When our National Academy of Sciences, NAS, Diet, Nutrition and Cancer Committee was deciding how to summarize the research on diet and cancer, we included chapters on individual nutrients and nutrient groups. This was the way research had been done, one nutrient at a time. For example, the chapter on vitamins included information on the relationships between cancer and vitamins A, C, E and some B vitamins. However, in the report summary, we recommended getting these nutrients from FODs, not pills or supplements. We explicitly stated that these recommendations apply only to foods as sources of nutrients, not to dietary supplements of individual nutrients. The report quickly found its way to the corporate world, which saw a major money-making opportunity. They ignored our cautionary message distinguishing foods from pills and began advertising vitamin pills as products that could prevent cancer, arrogantly citing our report as justification. This was a great opening to a vast new market: commercial vitamin supplements. General Nutrition Incorporated, the company with thousands of General Nutrition centers, started selling a product called Healthy Greens, a multivitamin supplement of vitamins A, C and E, beta-carotene, selenium and a minuscule half-gram of dehydrated vegetables. Then they advertised their product by making the following claims too. The Diet, Nutrition, and Cancer Reportal recommended we increase, among other things, our amounts of specific vegetables to help safeguard our bodies against the risk of certain forms of cancer. 270 The China Study. These vegetables recommended by the National Academy of Sciences Reportal are the ones we should increase: cabbages, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccoli, carrots and spinach. Mom was right. Research scientists and technicians at General Nutrition Labs, realizing the importance of the research, instantly went to work to harness all of the vegetables and combined all of them into a natural, easy to take potent tablet. The result is Health Greens Sick, a new potent breakthrough in nutrition that millions of people can now help safeguard their well-being with. The greens that the National Academy of Sciences Committee recommends we eat more of. GNC was advertising an untested product and improperly using a government document to support its sensational claims. So the Federal Trade Commission went to court to bar the company from making these claims. It was a battle that lasted years, a battle that was rumored to cost General Nutrition Incorporated about $7 million. The National Academy of Sciences recommended me as their expert witness because of my co-authorship of the report in question and because of my harping on this point during our committee deliberations. A research associate in my group, Dr. Tom O'Connor, and I spent 3 intellectually stimulating years working on this project, including my 3 full days on the witness stand. In 1988, General Nutrition, Inc. settled the false advertising charges relating to Healthy Greens and other food supplements by agreeing to pay $600,000, divided equally, to 3 different health organizations. Point 3 This was a small price for the company to pay, considering the ultimate revenues that were generated by the exploding nutrient supplement market. Focus on fat. The focus on individual nutrients instead of whole foods has become commonplace in the past 2 decades, and part of the blame can be put on our 1982 report. As mentioned before, our committee organized the scientific information on diet and cancer by nutrients, with a separate chapter for each nutrient or class of nutrients. There were individual chapters for fat, protein, carbohydrate, vitamins and minerals. I am convinced it was a great mistake on our part. We did not stress enough that our recommendations were concerned with whole foods because scientific reductionism. 271. Many people still regarded the report as cataloging the specific effects of individual nutrients. The nutrient that our committee focused on the most was fat. The first guideline in the report explicitly stated that high fat consumption is linked to cancer, and recommended reducing our fat intake from 40% to 30% of calories, although this goal of 30% was an arbitrary cutoff point. The accompanying text said, "Tree data could be used to justify an even greater reduction." However, in the judgment of the committee, the suggested reduction is a moderate and practical target, and is likely to be beneficial. One of the committee members, the director of the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, Nutrition Laboratory, told us that if we went below 30%, consumers would be required to reduce animal food intake, and that would be the death of the report. At the time of this report, all of the human-based studies showing fat to be related to cancer, mostly breast and large bowel, were actually showing that the populations with more cancer consumed not just more fat, but also more animal-based foods and less plant-based foods. See Chapter 4. This meant that these cancers could just as easily be caused by animal protein, dietary cholesterol, something else exclusively found in animal-based foods, or a lack of plant-based foods, discussed in chapters 4 and 8. But rather than wagging the finger at animal-based foods in these studies, dietary fat was given as the main culprit. I argued against putting the emphasis on specific nutrients in the committee meetings, but only with modest success. It was this point of view that landed me the expert witness opportunity at the FTC hearings. This mistake of characterizing whole foods by the health effects of specific nutrients is what I call reductionism. For example, the health effect of a hamburger cannot be simply attributed to the effect of a few grams of saturated fat in the meat. Saturated fat is merely one ingredient. Hamburgers also include other types of fat, in addition to cholesterol, protein, and very small amounts of vitamins and minerals. Even if you change the level of saturated fat in the meat, all of the other nutrients are still present and may still have harmful effects on health. It is a case of the whole, the hamburger, being greater than the sum of its parts, the saturated fat, the cholesterol, etc. One scientist especially took note of our focused critique of dietary fat, and decided to test the hypothesis that fat causes breast cancer in a large group of American women. He was Dr. Walter Willett of the 272 The China Study, Harvard School of Public Health, and the study he used is the famous Nurses' Health Study. Starting in 1976, researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health had enrolled over 120,000 nurses from around the country for a study that was intended to investigate the relationship between various diseases and oral contraceptives, postmenopausal hormones, cigarettes, and other factors, such as hair dyes. Beginning in 1980, Professor Willett added a dietary questionnaire to the study, and 4 years later, in 1984, expanded the dietary questionnaire to include more food items. This expanded dietary questionnaire was mailed to nurses again in 1986 and 1990. Data now have been collected for over 2 decades. The Nurses' Health Study is widely known as the longest-running, premier study on women's health. It has spawned 3 satellite studies, all together, costing $4 to $5 million per year. When I give lectures to health-conscious audiences, upwards of 70% of the people have heard of the Nurses' Health Study. The scientific community has followed this study closely. The researchers in charge of the study have produced hundreds of scientific articles in the best peer-reviewed journals. The design of the study makes it a prospective cohort study, which means it follows a group of people, a cohort, and records information on diets before disease events are diagnosed, making the study prospective. Many regard a prospective cohort study as the best experimental design for human studies. The question of whether diets high in fat are linked to breast cancer was a natural outgrowth of the fierce discussion going on in the mid-1970s and the early 1980s. High-fat diets not only were associated with heart disease, the McGovern dietary goals, but also with cancer, the Diet, Nutrition, and Cancer Report. What better study to answer this question than the Nurses' Health Study? It has a good design, massive Numbers of women, top flight researchers, and a long follow-up period. Sounds perfect, right? Wrong. The nurses' health study suffers from flaws that seriously do miss results. It is the premier example of how reductionism in science can create massive amounts of confusion and misinformation, even when the scientists involved are honest, well-intentioned, and positioned at the top institutions in the world. Hardly any study has done more damage to the nutritional landscape than the nurses' health study, and it should serve as a warning for the rest of science for what not to do. Scientific Reductionism 273. Carnivorous nurses. In order to understand my rather harsh criticism, it is necessary to obtain some perspective on the American diet itself, especially when compared with the international studies that gave impetus to the dietary fat hypothesis. 7 Americans eat a lot of meat and fat compared to developing countries. We eat more total protein, and even more significantly, 70% of our protein comes from animal sources. The fact that 70% of our total protein comes from animal sources means only one thing: we are consuming very few fruits and vegetables. To make matters worse, when we do eat plant-based foods, we eat a large amount of highly processed products that often have more added fat, sugar, and salt. For example, the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, National School lunch program counts French fried potatoes as a vegetable. In contrast, people in rural China eat very little animal foods. They provide only about 10% of their total protein intake. The striking difference between the two dietary patterns is shown in 2 ways in chart 4.1.8. These distinctions are typical of the dietary differences between Western cultures and traditional cultures. In general, people in Western countries are mostly meat eaters, and people in traditional countries are mostly plant eaters. So what about the women in the nurses' health study? As you might guess, virtually all of these women consume a diet very rich in animal-based foods, even richer than the average American. Their average protein intake, as percent of calories, is around 19%, compared with the U.S. Chart 14.1, protein intake in the U.S. and rural China. U.S. China QJ U.S. China CL. I_animal protein 0 plant protein 1 I_animal protein 0 plant protein I. Chart 14.2, percentage of total protein that comes from animal food. O plant protein. Animal protein. Nurses U.S. China. Average of about 15 to 16%. To give these figures some perspective, the recommended daily allowance, RDA, for protein is only about 9 to 10%. But even more importantly, of the protein consumed by the nurses in this study, between 78% and 86% comes from animal-based foods, 9 as shown in Chart 4.2.8, 9 even in the group of nurses that eat the lowest amount of total protein, 79% of it comes from animal-based foods. 9 in other words, virtually all of these nurses are more carnivorous than an average American woman. They consume very few whole, plant-based foods. This is a crucially important point. To get further perspective, I must return to the 1975 international comparison by Ken Carroll shown earlier in charts 4.7 to 4.9. Chart 4.7 is reproduced here in chart 14.3. This chart became one of the most influential observations on diet and chronic disease of the last 50 years. Like other studies, it was a significant part of the reason why the 1982 Diet, Nutrition, and Cancer report recommended that Americans cut their fat intake to 30% of total caloric intake in order to prevent cancer. This report and other consensus reports that followed thereafter eventually set the stage for an explosion of low-fat products in the marketplace, low-fat dairy products, lean cuts of meat, low-fat sweets and snack foods. Unfortunately, the emphasis on fat alone was misguided. Carroll's study, like all the other international comparisons, was comparing populations that mostly ate meat and dairy to populations that mostly ate plants. There were many more differences between the diets of these countries than just the fat intake. What Carroll's graph really shows is scientific reductionism 275. Chart 14.3, fat intake and breast cancer mortality. 0. Female. Netherlands, UK, Denmark, Canada, New Zealand, Rela D. Switzerland in US, Belgium, Australia, Sweden, Austria, Germany, Norway, France, Italy, Czech, Finland, Portugal, Hungary, Hong Kong, Poland, Chile, Venezuela, Bulgaria, Spain, Romania, Panama, Yugoslavia, Greece, Philippines, Colombia, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Japan, Taiwan, Ceylon, Thala. El Salvador, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 140, 160, 180. Total dietary fat intake, G/day. That the closer a population gets to consuming a plant-based diet, the lower its risk of breast cancer. But because the women in the nurses' health study are so far from a plant-based diet, there is no way to study the diet and breast cancer relationship originally suggested by the international studies. There are virtually no nurses that eat a diet typical of the countries at the bottom of this graph. Make no mistake about it, virtually this entire cohort of nurses is consuming a high-risk diet. Most people who look at the nurses' health study miss this flaw because, as Harvard researchers will point out, there is a wide range of fat intake among the nurses. The group of nurses who consume the least fat eat 20 to 25% of their calories as fat, and the group of nurses who consume the most fat eat 50 to 55% of their calories as fat. 10. At a casual glance, this range appears to indicate substantial differences in their diets, but this is just not true, as almost all women uniformly eat a diet very rich in animal-based foods. That begs the question, how can their fat intake vary dramatically while they all uniformly consume large amounts of animal-based foods? Ever since low-fat became synonymous with healthy, technology has created many of the same foods that you know and love, without the fat. You can now have all kinds of low-fat or no-fat dairy products, low-fat processed meats, low-fat dressings and sauces, low-fat crackers, low-fat candies and low-fat junk food, like chips and cookies. In other 276 the China study words, you can eat mostly the same foods as you did 25 years ago, while substantially reducing your fat intake. But you still retain the same proportion of animal and plant-based food intakes. In practical terms, this means that beef, pork, lamb, and veal consumption is decreasing while lower fat chicken, turkey, and fish consumption is increasing. In fact, by consuming more poultry and fish, people have been increasing their total meat intake to record high amounts, too, while trying, and largely failing, to reduce their fat intake. In addition, whole milk is being consumed less, but low-fat and skim milk are being consumed more. Cheese consumption has increased by 150% in the past 30 years. 13. Overall, We are as carnivorous now as we were 30 years ago, but we are able to selectively lower our fat intake if we so desire, due to the wonders of food technology. To illustrate, we need only to look at two typical American meals. 14, 15. Meal number 1 is served in a health-conscious horn, where the main grocery shopper in the family reads the nutrition labels on every food item he or she buys. The result, a low-fat dining experience. Meal number 2 is served in a home where the standard American fare is everyone's favorite. When they cook at home, they make the meal rich. The result, a high-fat dining experience. Chart 14.4, Low-fat and high-fat American dinners. One person's dinner. Low-fat meal number 1, high-fat meal number 2. Dinner 8 ounces. Roasted turkey 4.5 oz. Pan-seared steak. Low-fat gravy green beans almond dime. Golden roasted potatoes herb seasoned potato. Pockets. Beverage 1 cup skim milk water. Dessert non-fat yogurt apple crisp. Reduced fat cheesecake. Both meals provide roughly 1,000 calories, but are markedly different in their fat content. The low-fat meal, number 1, contains about 25 grams of fat, and the high-fat meal, number 2, contains just over 60 grams of fat. In the low-fat meal, 22% of the total calories come from fat, and in the high-fat meal, 54% of the calories come from fat. Scientific Reductionism 277. The health-conscious home has managed to create a meal that is much lower in fat than the average American dinner, but they've done it without adjusting their proportionate intakes of animal and plant-based foods. Both meals are centered on animal-based foods. In fact, the low-fat meal actually has more animal-based foods than the high-fat meal. In effect, this is how the nurses in the nurses' health study achieved such a wide variation in fat intake. Some nurses simply are more diligent about choosing low-fat animal products. Many people would consider the low-fat meal to be a triumph of healthy meal planning, but what about the other nutrients in these meals? What about protein and cholesterol? As it turns out, the low-fat meal contains more than double the protein of the high-fat meal, and almost all of it comes from animal-based foods. In addition, the low-fat meal contains almost twice as much cholesterol, chart 14.5, point 14,15. Chart 14.5, nutrient contents of 2 sample meals. Low-fat meal number 1, high-fat meal number 2. Fat, percent of total calories, 22%, 54%. Protein 36%, 16%. Percent of total calories. Percentage of total protein 93%, 86%. Derived from animal-based foods. Cholesterol 307, 165. An overwhelming amount of scientific information suggests that diets high in animal-based protein can have unfavorable health consequences, as can diets high in cholesterol. In the low-fat meal, the amount of both of these unhealthy nutrients is significantly higher. Fat versus animal food. When women in America, such as those in the nurses' health study and the $1 billion for women's health trial I6-19 reduce their fat intake, they do not do it by reducing their consumption of animal-based foods. Instead, they use low-fat and non-fat animal products, along with less fat, during cooking and at the table. Thus, they are not adopting the diets that were shown, in the international correlation studies and in our rural China study, to be associated with low breast cancer rates. 278 The China study. This is a very important discrepancy, and is illustrated by the correlation between the consumption of dietary animal protein and dietary fat. For a group of countries, chart 14.6, 0.8,9, 18,20-22. The most reliable comparison was published Indiana 19752. Degree, it showed a highly convincing correlation of more than 90%. This means that as fat intake goes up in various countries, animal protein intake increases in an almost perfectly parallel manner. Likewise, in the China study, the intakes of fat and animal protein also show a similar correlation of 84%. 8,21. In the nurses' health study, this is not the case. The correlation between animal protein and total fat intakes is only about 16%. In the women's health trial, also including American women, it is even worse, at _17%. 18,21,22, as fat goes down, animal protein goes up. This practice is typical of American women who have been led to believe that, by decreasing their fat intake, they are changing to a healthier diet. A nurse consuming a low-fat diet in the Harvard study, like American women everywhere, is likely to continue eating large amounts of animal protein, as shown in meal number 1, chart 14.4. Sadly, this evidence on the effects of animal-based food on cancer and other diseases of affluence has been ignored, even maligned, as we continue to focus on fat and other nutrients in isolation. Because of this, the nurses' health study and virtually every other human epidemiological study published to date have been seriously shortchanged in their in 100. Chart 14.6% correlations of total fat and animal protein consumption. China. Nurses' health study. International I. Women's health study. Scientific reductionism 279. Investigations of diet and disease associations. Virtually all the subjects under study consume the very diet that causes diseases of affluence. If one kind of animal-based food is substituted for another, then the adverse health effects of both foods, when compared to plant-based food, are easily missed. To make matters worse, these studies often focus on the consumption of just one nutrient, such as fat. Because of these very serious flaws, these studies have been a virtual disaster for discovering the really significant effects of diet on these diseases. The $100 plus million results. So now that you know how I interpret the nurses' health study and its flaws, we should take a look at its conclusions. After more than $100 million and decades of work, there is no shortage of results. So what are they? The logical place to start is, of course, the question of whether fat intake really is linked to breast cancer. Here are some of the findings. Cited verbatim. These data provide evidence against both an adverse influence of fat intake and a protective effect of fiber consumption by middle-aged women on breast cancer incidence over 8 years. 23. Translation: the nurses' health study did not detect a relationship between dietary fat and fiber and breast cancer risk. We found no evidence that lower intake of total fat or specific major types of fat was associated with decreased risk of breast cancer. L0. Translation: the nurses' health study did not detect a relationship between reducing fat, whether it be total fat or certain kinds of fat, and breast cancer risk. Existing data, however, provide little support for the hypothesis that reduction in dietary fat composition, even to 20% of energy during adulthood, will lead to a substantial reduction in breast cancer in Western cultures. 24. Translation: the nurses' health study did not detect a breast cancer association with fat even when women reduced their fat consumption, all the way down to 20% of calories. 280 The China study. Relative risks for monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat were close to unity. 25. Translation: the nurse's health study did not detect a relationship between these good fats and breast cancer risk. We found no significant associations between intake of meat and dairy products and risk of breast cancer. 26. Translation: the nurse's health study did not detect a relationship between meat and dairy consumption and breast cancer risk. Our findings do not support a link between physical activity in late adolescence or in the recent past and breast cancer risk among young adult women. 27. Translation: the nurse's health study did not detect a relationship between exercise and breast cancer risk. These data are suggestive of only a weak positive association with substitution of saturated fat for carbohydrate consumption. None of the other types of fat examined was significantly associated with breast cancer risk relative to an equivalent reduction in carbohydrate consumption. 28. Translation: the nurse's health study detected little or no effect on breast cancer when women substituted fat for carbohydrates. Selenium intake later in life is not likely to be an important factor in the etiology of breast cancer. 29. Translation: the nurse's health study did not detect a protective effect of selenium on breast cancer risk. These results suggest that fruit and vegetable consumption during adulthood is not significantly associated with reduced breast cancer risk. 30. Translation: the nurse's health study did not detect a relationship between fruits and vegetables and breast cancer risk. So there it is, readers. Breast cancer risk does not rise with increased intakes of fat, meat, dairy or saturated fat. Breast cancer is not prevented. Scientific reductionism. 281. By increased intakes of fruits and vegetables, or reduced by exercise, either during the teenage years or during adulthood, dietary fiber, monounsaturated fats or polyunsaturated fats. Also, the mineral selenium, long considered to be protective of certain cancers, has no effect on breast cancer. In other words, we might as well conclude that diet is completely unrelated to breast cancer. I can understand the frustration of Professor Meir Stampfer, one of the leading researchers in this group, when he was quoted as saying, "This has been our greatest failure and disappointment that we have not learned more about what people can do to lower their risk." 6. He was making his comment in response to an opinion that the single biggest challenge for the future is sorting out the mess of contradictory findings and lack of information on breast cancer. 6. I applaud Professor Stampfer for his candor, but it's unfortunate that so much money has been spent to learn so little. Perhaps the most rewarding finding, ironically, was the demonstration that tinkering with one nutrient at a time, while maintaining the same overall dietary patterns, does not lead to better health or to better health information. Yet Harvard researchers have been steadily cranking out their findings, despite these challenges. From their slew of studies, here are some findings that I would consider as very troubling contradictions when comparing disease risks for men versus women. Men who consume alcohol 3 or 4 times a week have a lower heart attack risk. 31. Men with type 2 diabetes who consume a moderate amount of alcohol have a lower risk of coronary heart disease. 32. And yet, alcohol consumption increases breast cancer incidence by 41%. For women consuming 30 to 60 gl day of alcohol compared to non-drinking women. 33. Apparently alcohol is good for heart disease and bad for breast cancer. The husband can have a drink with dinner but should never share it with his wife. Is this a difference between men and women, or is this a difference in response between heart disease and cancer? Do you feel more informed or more confused? Then there are those wonderful omega-3 fatty acids. Some types of fish contain relatively large amounts of these fats and have been getting 282 the China study. Their share of positive press these days. If you've heard anything about omega-3 fatty acids, it's that you need more of them to be healthy. Again, more Harvard findings. Contrary to the predominant hypothesis, we found an increased risk of breast cancer associated with omega-3 fat from fish. This increased risk was statistically significant and was associated with an increase of only 0.1% of the total dietary energy. L0. Our findings suggest that eating fish once per month or more can reduce the risk of ischemic stroke in men 34. Data suggests that consumption of fish at least once per week may reduce the risk of sudden cardiac death in men but not reduce the risk of total myocardial infarction, non-sudden cardiac death, or total cardiovascular mortality 35. In other words, fish may prevent some aspects of heart disease but ultimately has no effect on mortality from heart disease, or even heart attack risk. Is this yet another question of deciding which disease you fear the least? Or is this another man versus woman difference? Here's an even older story. We have been warned for a long time to cut down on our cholesterol intake, and it was largely for this reason that consumption of eggs was brought into question. One egg has a whopping 200 milligrams or more of cholesterol 36, which takes up a large proportion of our 300 milligrams recommended daily limit. So, what do the Harvard studies tell us on this time-worn issue? Consumption of up to 1 egg per day is unlikely to have substantial overall impact on the risk of CHD or stroke among healthy men and women 3. But, for breast cancer, our findings representing 8 prospective studies suggest a possible modest increase in breast cancer risk with egg consumption. Breast cancer risk was found to increase by 22% with every 100 g per day increment of egg consumption, about 2 eggs J26. There was a 67% increase in risk for the Nurses Health 52D.J26. But earlier, the Harvard researchers took a slightly different position. Among healthy men and women, moderate egg consumption can be part of a nutritious and balanced diet 38. R. Scientific Reductionism 283. Most recently, the Nurses Health study is cited as having come up with an even more powerful endorsement for eggs. A recent news item stated, eating eggs during adolescence could protect women against breast cancer. 39. The article goes on to quote a Harvard researcher as saying, women who had, during adolescence, a higher consumption of eggs, had a lower risk of breast cancer. 39. Most people who read this news article will likely say that eggs are back in favor even when they don't know how many eggs per day are okay, or whether there are exceptions to this generalization. Eggs will only seem to be more healthful when the henhouse industry adds their words of wisdom. But wait a minute, evidence says egg consumption for teenage girls is okay, maybe even good, but evidence also says more. Egg consumption overall increases breast cancer risk. By the way, here's something else to think about. Multiple studies have rather consistently shown that egg consumption can increase colon cancer risk, more so for women than for men. W. What are we to believe? 1 minute alcohol intake can reduce our disease risks, the next minute it can increase them. 1 minute fish Consumption can help to reduce our disease risks. The next minute it can hurt. 1 minute eggs are bad, the next minute they can be healthy. It seems to me that what is missing here is the larger context. What you have without that context is just a lot of confusion. Unraveling diet and cancer. In addition to stating that diet and exercise are unrelated to breast cancer, the Harvard researchers have been chipping away at other popular notions regarding diet and cancer. For example, the Harvard studies have not been able to detect any association between colorectal cancer and fiber or fruit and vegetable intake. 441.42. Dietary fiber, of course, only comes from plant-based foods, thus these findings put a dent in the idea that fiber or fruits, vegetables and cereals prevent large bowel cancer. Keep in mind that the Harvard studies are dealing with uniformly carnivorous populations, almost none of which are using a whole foods, plant-based diet that is naturally low in fat and high in fiber. It is likely that the potential protective effect of 284 the China study, fiber or fruits and vegetables, does not kick in against colorectal cancer until there is a complete dietary shift away from an animal-based diet. Between the colon cancer and breast cancer findings, the nurses' health study has done much to confuse, if not discredit, the idea that diet is related to cancer. After these decades of work, Professor Walt Willett says, increasing fruits and vegetables overall appears to be less promising as a way to substantially reduce cancer risk. The benefits of these foods appear greater for cardiovascular disease than for cancer. This statement sounds a bit ominous. Colon cancer, historically one of the first cancers said to be prevented by a plant-based diet, 43-45, now is being said to be unrelated to diet, and low-fat diets don't prevent breast cancer. With results like these, it's only a matter of time before the hypothesis of a dietary connection to cancer starts falling apart. In fact, I have already heard people within the scientific community beginning to say that diet may have no effect on cancer. These are the reasons that I believe that the nurses' health study has done considerable damage to the nutrition landscape. It has virtually nullified many of the advances that have been made over the past 50 years without actually posing a scientifically reliable challenge to earlier findings regarding diet and cancer. This problem of studying a population that uniformly consumes a high-risk diet and looking at the differences in consumption of one nutrient at a time is not unique to the nurses' health study. It is common to virtually all studies using Western subjects. Furthermore, there is little or no value to pooling the results of many large studies for analysis. In order to get a more reliable result if all the studies have the same flaw, a pooling strategy is often used for identifying cause and effect associations that are more subtle and uncertain within single studies. This is a reliable assumption when each study is properly done, but obviously it is not when all the studies are similarly flawed. The combined results only give a more reliable picture of the flaw. The Harvard researchers have done several of these multi-study pooled analyses. One such pooled analysis concerned the question of whether meat and dairy foods had any effect on breast cancer. 26. A previous 1993 pooling of 19 studies, 46 had shown a modest, statistically significant 18% increase in breast cancer risk with increased meat intake. Scientific reductionism 285. And 17% increase with increased milk intake. 46. The Harvard researchers therefore summarized in 2002 a more recent group of studies, this time including 8 large prospective studies where dietary information was thought to be more reliable and where a much larger group of women was included. The researchers concluded, we found no significant association between intake of meat or dairy products and risk of breast cancer. 26. Most people would say, well, that's it. There is no convincing evidence that meat and dairy foods are associated with breast cancer risk. But let's take another look at this supposedly more sophisticated analysis. All 8 of these studies represented diets that had a high proportion of animal-based foods. In effect, each study in this pool was subject to the same flaw from which the nurses' health study suffered. It makes no sense, and does no good, to combine them. In spite of there being 351,041 women and 7,379 breast cancer cases in this megadatabase. These results cannot detect the true effect of diets rich in meat and dairy on breast cancer risk. This would be true even if there were a few million subjects in the study. Like the nurses' health study, these studies all involved typical Western diets highly skewed toward the consumption of animal-based foods, where people are tinkering with the intake of only one nutrient or one food at a time. Every study failed to take into account a broader range of dietary choices, including those which demonstrated positive effects on breast cancer risk in the past. Ignoring my critique. Once, after reading a publication on animal protein and heart disease, in the Nurses' Health Study 9, I published a critique 47 summarizing some of the same points that I am making in this chapter, including the inability of the Nurses' Health Study to advance our understanding of the original international correlation studies. They responded, and our exchange is as follows. First, my comment. Within a dietary range so rich in animal-based foods, 1, it makes no sense to me that it is possible to reliably detect the so-called independent associations of the individual constituents of this group, when it can be expected that they share the same disease outcomes. 286 The China Study. And when there are so many difficult to measure and interacting risk factor exposures, when will it be understood that it is the total diet and the aggregate and comprehensive effects of large food groups that make the greatest contribution to the maintenance of health and prevention of disease? The sort of reductionism embodied in the interpretation of data from this nurses' health study J cohort runs the risk of severely misleading discourse on meaningful public health and public policy programs. Why? Then the response from Dr. Hu and Professor Willett. Although we agree that overall dietary patterns are also important in determining disease risk, Rev. cited, we believe that identification of associations with individual nutrients should be the first step, because it is the specific compounds or groups of compounds that are fundamentally related to the disease process. J. Specific components of diet can be modified, and individuals and the food industry are actively doing so. Understanding the health effects of specific dietary changes, which Campbell refers to as reductionism, is therefore an important undertaking. 48. I agree that studying the independent effects of individual food substances, their identities, functions, mechanisms, is worthwhile. But Willett and I sharply disagree with how to interpret and use these findings. I strongly reject the implications in Willett's argument that specific components of the diet can be modified to the benefit of one's health. This is precisely what is wrong with this area of research. In fact, if the nurses' health study shows nothing else, it demonstrates that modifying the intake of one nutrient at a time, without questioning whole dietary patterns, does not confer significant health benefits. Women who tinker with fat, while maintaining a near carnivorous diet, do not have a lower breast cancer risk. This gets to the heart of reductionism in science. As long as scientists study highly isolated chemicals and food components, and take the information out of context to make sweeping assumptions about complex diet and disease relationships, confusion will result. Misleading news headlines about this or that food chemical and this or that disease will be the norm. The more impressive message about the benefits of broad dietary change will be muted as long as we focus on relatively trivial details. Scientific Reductionism 287. On occasions, when our paths have crossed, Professor Willett and I have had discussions about the findings on fat as they relate to the China study and the nurses' health study. I have always made the same point: whole foods, plant-based diets, naturally low in fat, are not included in the nurses' health study cohort, and that it is these types of diets that are the most beneficial for our health. Professor Willett has said to me, in response, on more than one occasion, "You may be right, Colin, but people don't want to go there." This comment has disturbing implications. Scientists should not be ignoring ideas just because we perceive that the public does not want to hear them. Too often during my career, I have heard comments that seem to be more of an attempt to please the public than to engage in an open, honest debate, wherever it may take us. This is wrong. The role of science in a society is to observe, to ask questions, to form and test hypotheses and to interpret the findings without bias, not to kowtow to people's perceived desires. Consumers have the ultimate choice of whether to integrate our findings into their lifestyles, but we owe it to them to give them the best information possible with which to make that decision and not decide for them. It is they who paid for this research, and it is only they who have the right to decide what to do with it. The perception in the scientific community that the public only wants magic bullets and simple dietary tinkering is overrated. I have learned in my public lectures that there is more interest in detailed lifestyle change than the academic community is willing to admit. This method of investigating details out of context, what I call reductionism, and trying to judge complex relationships from the results is deadly. It is even more damaging than the misbehavior of the small minority of scientists I discussed in Chapter 13. Unfortunately, this flawed way of investigating nutrition has become the norm. As a consequence, honest, hard-working, well-intentioned scientists around the world are forced to make judgments about whole dietary effects on the basis of narrowly focused studies on individual nutrients. The greatest danger is that reductionism science, standing naked from its larger environment, has come to be the gold standard. Indeed, I know many researchers who would even say that this is what defines good science. These problems are especially egregious in the investigation of vitamin supplements. As I noted at the beginning of the chapter, I spent over 3 years during the early history of the nutrient supplement. 288 The HENA study. Business developing testimony for the Federal Trade Commission and the National Academy of Sciences in their court case against General Nutrition Incorporated. I argued that specific health benefits for chronic diseases could not be claimed for isolated vitamins and minerals in supplement form. For this, I took a lot of heat from my colleagues who believed otherwise. Now, more than 15 years later, after hundreds of millions of dollars of research funding and billions of dollars of consumer spending, we now have this conclusion from a recent survey of the evidence. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, USPSF, concludes that the evidence is insufficient to recommend for or against the use of supplements of A, CORE, multivitamins with folic acid, or antioxidant combinations for the prevention of cancer or cardiovascular disease. How many more billions of dollars must be spent before we understand the limitations of reductionist research? Scientific investigations of the effects of single nutrients on complex diseases have little or no meaning when the main dietary effect is due to the consumption of an extraordinary collection of nutrients and other substances found in whole foods. This is especially true when no subjects in the study population consume a whole foods, plant-based diet, when it is this diet that is most consistent with the biologically based evidence, supported by the most impressive array of professional literature, consonant with the extremely low disease rates seen in the international studies, far more harmonious with a sustainable environment, possessed of the power to heal advanced disease, and has the potential, without parallel, for supporting a new, low-cost healthcare system. I categorically reject the idea of doing reductionism research in this field without seeking or understanding the larger context. The endless stream of confusion generated by misinterpreted reductionism undermines not only the entire science of nutrition, but also the health of America. The science of industry. What does every American spend money on several times a day? Eating. After a lifetime of eating, what do we all do? A process that usually involves large costs as we try to postpone it for as long as possible. We're all customers of hunger and death, so there's a lot of money to be spent and made. Because of this, the food and health industries in America are among the most influential organizations in the world. The revenue generated by the companies that produce food and health products is staggering. Many individual food companies have over $10 billion in annual revenues. Kraft has revenues of roughly $30 billion a year. The Danone Group, an international dairy company based in France, operates the Danone brand and has revenues of $15 billion a year. And of course, there are the large fast food companies. McDonald's has revenues in excess of $15 billion a year, and Wendy's International generates almost $3 billion a year. Total food expenditures, including food bought by individuals, government, and business, exceed $700 billion a year. The massive drug company Pfizer had $32 billion in revenue in 2002, while Eli Lilly and Colin Co. chalked up over $11 billion. Johnson & Johnson collected over $36 billion from selling their products. It's not an overstatement to say over $1 trillion every year is riding on what we choose to eat and how we choose to treat sickness and promote health. That's a lot of money. There are powerful players that compete for your food and health dollars. Individual companies, of course, do what they can to sell more of their products, but also there are industry groups that work to increase general demand for their products. The National Dairy Council, National Dairy Promotion and Research Board, National Fluid Milk Processor Promotion Board, International Sprout Growers Association, American Meat Institute, Florida Citrus Processors Association, and United Egg Producers are examples of such industry groups. These organizations, operating independently of any single company, wield significant influence. The most powerful among them have yearly budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars. These food companies and associations use whatever methods they can to enhance their products' appeal and grow their market. One way to accomplish this is to claim nutritional benefits for the food products they sell. At the same time, these companies and associations must protect their products from being considered unhealthy. If a product is linked to cancer or some other disease, profits and revenue will evaporate. So food business interests need to claim that their product is good for you, or, at least, that it's not bad for you. In this process, the science of nutrition becomes the business of marketing. The Airport Club. While I was getting the China study off the ground, I learned of a committee of 7 prominent research scientists who had been retained by the animal-based foods industry, the National Dairy Council and the American Meat Institute, to keep tabs on any research projects in the U.S. likely to cause harm to their industry. I knew 6 of the 7 members, 4 of them quite well. A graduate student of mine was visiting with one of these scientists and was given a file on the committee activity. I have never learned exactly why the file passed hands. Perhaps the scientist's conscience was getting the better of him. In any case, the file was ultimately given to me. The file contained minutes of committee meetings, the latest being held at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. From then on, I have called this group of scientists the Airport Club. It was run by Professors E. M. Foster and Michael Pariza, faculty members of the University of Wisconsin, where O'Harper was located, and was funded by the meat and dairy industry. This committee's main objective was to have members observe projects that might do harm to their industry. With such surveillance, the industry could more effectively respond to unexpected discoveries. L. The Science of Industry 291. From researchers that might make otherwise unanticipated news. I had learned well that, when the stakes are high, industry was not averse to putting its own spin on a story. They listed about 9 potentially damaging projects, and I had the dubious distinction of being the only researcher responsible for 2 of the projects. I was named once for the China study, which one of the members was assigned to watch over, and once for my association with the American Institute for Cancer Research (CAICR), especially my chairing of the review panel that decided which research applications on diet and cancer got funded. Another panel member had the task of keeping an eye on the AICR activity. After learning of the Airport Club, and of the individual assigned to watch over me at the AICR grant meetings, I was in a position to see how his spying was going to unfold. I went into the first AICR review panel meeting after learning of the club with an eye on the spy who was keeping an eye on me. One might argue that this industry-funded spying was not illegal, and that it is prudent for a business to keep tabs on potentially damaging information that might affect its future. I agree completely, even if it was disconcerting to find myself on the list of those being spied on. But industry does more than just keep tabs on dangerous research. It actively markets its version, regardless of potentially disastrous health effects, and corrupts the integrity of the science to do so. This is especially troubling when academic scientists do the spying and hide their intentions. Powerful groups. The dairy industry, one of the sponsors of the Airport Club, is particularly powerful in this country. Founded in 1915, the well-organized, well-funded National Dairy Council has been promoting milk for almost 100 years. 2 in 1995, 2 major milk industry groups put a new face on their old establishment, renaming it Dairy Management, Inc. The purpose of this new group was to do one thing: increase demand for U.S. produced dairy products. To cite their website, point 3, they had a 2003 marketing budget of more than $165 million to do it. Point 4, in comparison, the National Watermelon Promotion Board has a budget of $1.6 million. 5A Dairy Management Incorporated press release includes the following items for 292 the HENA study. Rosemont, Illinois National, State and Regional Dairy Producer. Directors have approved a budget of $165.7 million for a 2003 Unified Marketing Plan, designed to help increase dairy demand. Major program areas include fluid milk, in addition to key ongoing activities in advertising, promotion and public relations efforts targeted to children ages 6 to 12 and their mothers. 2003 dairy checkoff efforts will focus on developing and extending partnerships with major food marketers, including Kellogg's Registered, Kraft Foods Registered and McDonald's Registered. School marketing, as part of an effort to guide school-age children to become lifelong consumers of dairy products. 2003 activities will target students, parents, educators, and school food service professionals. Programs are underway in both the classroom and the lunchroom, where dairy checkoff organizations look to widen the success of last year's school milk pilot test. Dairy Image/Confidence, this ongoing program area aims to protect and enhance consumer confidence in dairy products and the dairy industry. A major component involves conducting and communicating the results of dairy nutrition research showing the healthfulness of dairy products, as well as issues and crisis management. If I may paraphrase the dairy industry's efforts, their goals are to 1. Market to young children and their mothers. 2. Use schools as a channel to young customers. 3. Conduct and publicize research favorable to the industry. Many people are not aware of the dairy industry's presence in our schools. But make no mistake, on nutrition information, the dairy industry reaches young children more effectively than any other industry. The dairy industry has enlisted the public education system as the primary vehicle for increasing demand for its products. The 2001 Dairy Management Incorporated annual report stated 6. As the best avenue to increase fluid milk consumption long term. Children are without a doubt the future of dairy consumption. That's why the dairy checkoff continues to implement school milk marketing programs as one way to help increase kids' fluid milk consumption. The Science of Industry 293. Dairy producers launched 2 groundbreaking initiatives in 2001. A year-long school milk research program that began in the fall of 2001 examines how improved packaging, additional flavors, coolers with merchandising and better temperature regulation can affect fluid milk consumption and kids' attitudes toward milk both in and out of school. The study concludes at the end of the 2001-02 school year. Also, dairy producers and processors worked together to conduct a 5-month vending study in middle and high schools in 5 major U.S. markets. The study revealed that many students would choose milk over competitive beverages if it were available when, where, and how they wanted. Many other successful school programs continue to encourage children to drink milk. Nutrition education programs, such as Pyramid Explorations and Pyramid Cafe, teach students that dairy products are a key part of a healthy diet. The Cold is Cool program teaches school cafeteria managers how to keep milk cold, just how kids like it, and the checkoff is helping expand dairy-friendly school breakfast programs. In addition, the popular Got Milk campaign continues to reach children at school and through such kid-focused media outlets as Nickelodeon and the Cartoon Network. These activities are far from small-scale. In 1999, Chef Combo's Fantastic Adventures, an educational, marketing, set of lesson plans produced by the dairy industry, was placed in 76% of preschool Kindergarten sites nationally 7 according to a dairy industry report 2. Congress 8. The dairy industry's nutrition education programs are doing quite well. Pyramid Cafe registered and Pyramid Explorations trademark, targeted to 2nd and 4th grades, reach over 12 million students with messages that milk and dairy products are a key part of a healthy diet. Survey results continue to show a very high utilization rate for these two programs, currently at over 70% of the instructors that have the programs. America is entrusting the important task of educating our children about nutrition and health to the dairy industry. In addition to ubiquitous nutrition lesson plans and educational kits, the industry supplies high schools with videos, posters, and teaching guides regarding nutrition. It runs special promotions in cafeterias to increase milk consumption in 294 the China study. Thousands of schools. It distributes information to principals at national conferences. It runs back-to-school promotions with over 20,000 schools. And it runs sports promotions targeted toward youth. Should we be worried? In a word, yes. If you are curious as to what kind of education is being taught by the dairy industry, take a look at their website. Point 9. When I visited the site in July 2003, one of the first bits of information to greet me was, July is National Ice Cream Month. Upon clicking for more information on National Ice Cream Month, I read, if you're wondering if you can have your ice cream and good nutrition too, the answer is yes. 9. Great. So much for combating childhood obesity and diabetes. The website is divided up into 3 sections, one for educators, one for parents, and one for food service professionals. When I looked at the website in July 2003, the website regularly changes its content. In the educator portion of the site, teachers could download lesson plans to teach nutrition to their classrooms. Lesson plans included making hand puppets of cows and dairy foods and doing a finger play. Once the puppets are made, the teacher should tell the students they're going to meet 5 special friends, and these friends want boys and girls to grow up to be strong and healthy. 9. Another lesson was Dairy Treat Day, where each child gets to taste cheese, pudding, yogurt, cottage cheese, and ice cream. 9. Or teachers could lead their classes in making moo masks. 9. For the more advanced 4th grader, teachers could do a lesson plan from Pyramid Explorations in which students explore the 5 food groups and their health benefits, as follows. 9. Milk group, build strong bones and teeth. Meat group, build strong muscles. Vegetable group, help you see in the dark. Fruit group, help heal cuts and bruises. Grain group, give us energy. Based on the evidence presented in the previous chapters, you know that if this is what our children are learning about nutrition and health, then we are in for a painful journey, courtesy of Dairy Management, Inc. Obviously, neither kids nor their parents are learning about how milk has been linked to type 1 diabetes, prostate cancer, osteoporosis, multiple sclerosis, or other autoimmune diseases, and how casein, the main protein in dairy foods, has been shown to experimentally promote cancer and increase blood cholesterol and atherosclerotic plaque. The Science of Industry 295. In 2002, this marketing website delivered over 70,000 lesson plans to educators. The dairy industry truly is teaching its version of nutrition to the next generation of Americans. The industry has been doing this for decades, and it has been successful. I have encountered many people who, when they hear about the potential adverse effects of dairy foods, immediately say, milk can't be bad. Usually these people don't have any evidence to support their position, they just have a feeling that milk is good. They've always known it to be that way, and they like it that way. You can trace some of their opinions back to their school days, when they learned that there are 7 continents, 2 plus 2 equals 4, and milk is healthy. If you think about it this way, you will understand why the dairy industry has had such exceptional influence in this country by using education for its marketing purposes. If this marketing program weren't such a widespread threat to our children's health, it would be downright laughable that an industry group would try to peddle its food product under such a thinly veiled education plan. Don't people wonder what's going on when almost every single children's book advertised in the nutrition bookshelf portion of this website revolved around either milk, cheese, or ice cream? With such titles as Ice Cream, Great Moments in Ice Cream History. 9 After all, during July 2003 there were no vegetable books anywhere to be found on this nutrition bookshelf. Aren't they healthy? At least when the dairy industry describes all of these school-related activities in the official reports to Congress and in industry press releases, it rightly refers to them as marketing activities. Conjugated linoleic acid. The dairy industry doesn't stop with kids. For adults, the industry puts a heavy emphasis on science and the communication of research results that might be construed as showing health benefits from eating dairy foods. The dairy industry spends $4 to $5 million a year to fund research towards the goal of finding something healthy to talk about. 7. 10. In addition, the dairy industry promoters employ a medical advisory board made up of doctors, academics, and other health professionals. These scientists are the ones who appear as medical professionals in the media, providing science-based statements supporting the health benefits of milk. The Airport Club was a good example of industry efforts to maintain 296 the China study favorable product image and confidence. In addition to keeping an eye on potentially damaging projects, the club was trying to generate research that might show that cancer could be prevented by drinking cow's milk. What a coup that would be. At that time, the industry was getting quite edgy about the growing evidence showing that the consumption of animal-based foods is associated with cancer and related ailments. Their hook for this research was an unusual group of fatty acids produced by bacteria in the cow's rumen, the biggest of the 4 stomachs. These fatty acids were collectively called conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, which is produced from the linoleic acid commonly found in corn that the cow eats. From the cow's rumen, CLA is then absorbed and gets stored in the meat and milk of the animal, eventually to be consumed by humans. The big payday for the Airport Club was when initial tests on experimental mice suggested that CLA might help to block the formation of stomach tumors produced by a weak chemical carcinogen called benzo-A-pyrene LL-12. But there was a catch in this research. The catch was that researchers gave CLA to the mice first, and then gave the carcinogen benzo-A-pyrene. The ordering of these chemical feedings was backwards. In the body there is an enzyme system that works to minimize the amount of cancer caused by a carcinogen. When a chemical such as CLA is initially consumed, it excites that enzyme system so that it has increased activity. So the trick was to administer CLA first, to excite the enzyme system, and then administer the carcinogen. In this order, the enzyme system excited by CLA would be more effective at getting rid of the carcinogen. As a result, CLA could be called an anti-carcinogen. Let me give you an analogous situation. Let's say you have a bag of a potent pesticide in your garage. The pesticide bag says, "Do not swallow. In case of ingestion, contact your local poison control health authorities," or some such warning. But let's say you're hungry and you eat a handful of pesticide anyway. That pesticide in your body will rev up the enzyme systems in all of your cells that are responsible for eliminating nasty things. If you then go inside and eat a handful of peanuts dripping with aflatoxin, your body's enzyme systems will be primed to deal with the aflatoxin, and you'll end up with fewer aflatoxin-induced tumors. So, the pesticide, which will ultimately do all sorts of nasty things in your body, is an anti-carcinogen. This scenario is obviously absurd, and the research on mice that initially showed CLA to be in The Science of Industry 297 anti-carcinogen was similarly absurd. However, the end results of the mice research sounded pretty good to people who don't know this methodology, including most scientists. Airport Club member Michael Periza headed the research that studied CLA in some detail. 13. 1 second later, at Roswell Park Memorial Institute for Cancer Research in Buffalo, a very good researcher and his group extended the research still further and demonstrated that it did more than merely block the first step in the formation of tumors. CLA also appeared to slow down subsequent tumor growth 17 when fed after the carcinogen. This was a more convincing finding of the anti-cancer properties of CLA than the initial studies LL-12, which showed only an inhibition of tumor initiation. Regardless of how promising these mouse and cow studies were becoming, this research remained 2 major steps removed from human cancer. First, it had not been shown that cow's milk containing CLA as a whole food, as opposed to the isolated chemical CLA, prevents cancer in mice. Second, even if such an effect existed in mice, it would need to be confirmed in humans. In fact, as has been discussed earlier in this book, if cow's milk has any effect at all, it has been shown to increase, not decrease, cancer. The far more significant nutrient in milk is protein, whose potent cancer-promoting properties are consistent with the human data. In other words, to make any health claims regarding CLA in milk and its effect on human cancer would require unreasonably large leaps of faith, but never doubt the tenacity, i.e., money, of those who would like to have the public believe that cow's milk prevents cancer. Low end. Behold, a recent front page headline in our local newspaper, the Ithaca Journal, stated changing cows' diets elevates milk's cancer fighting LB. This article concerned the studies of a Cornell professor who was instrumental in the development of bovine growth hormone now fed to cows. He showed that he could increase CLA in cow's milk by feeding the animals more corn oil. The Ithaca Journal article, although only in a local, hometown newspaper, really was a dream come true for the sponsors of the Airport Club. The headline delivers a powerful but very simple message to the public: drinking milk reduces cancer risk. I know that media people like punchy statements, so, initially, I suspected that the reporter had made claims beyond what the researchers had said. But in the article, the enthusiasm expressed by Professor Baumann for the implications for this 298 the China study research equaled that of the headline. The study cited in this article only showed that CLA is higher in the milk of cows fed corn oil. That's a long way from having any relevance to human cancer. No studies had yet shown that humans or even mice drinking cow's milk had a lower risk of cancer of any kind. Yet Baumann, who is a technically competent researcher, was quoted as saying that these findings have good potential because CLA happens to be a very potent anti-carcinogen. The journalist went on to say CLA has been shown to suppress carcinogens and inhibit the spread of colon, prostate, ovarian and breast cancers and leukemia, and concluded that all indications are that CLA is effective in humans even in low concentrations. According to the article, Bauman says that this research represents the new focus on designing foods to enhance their nutritional and health qualities. These claims could not be more dramatic, considering the absence of the necessary human research. Bauman, Pariza, and their many other colleagues 19 have vigorously pursued this line of research for 15 years and have published a large number of research papers. Although additional beneficial effects of CLA are said to exist, the key research still has not been done, namely testing whether the consumption of milk from cows fed high corn oil diets really will reduce human cancer risk. More recently, Bauman and his colleagues have attempted to take a step toward finding this essential connection. They have shown that the milk fat of cows fed high amounts of corn oil, i.e., linoleic acid, the parent of CLA, like synthetic CLA, was able to decrease tumors in rats treated with the carcinogen 2O. But again, they used the tricky experimental method. They administered the milk fat before, not after the carcinogen. Yet their claims will be as dramatic as ever, because this is the first time that CLA, as present in food, i.e., the fat, is shown to be as anti-carcinogenic as the isolated chemical. Translated, eat butter from cows fed corn oil, it prevents cancer. The science of industry. The CLA story is a good example of how industry uses science to increase demand for its product in order to make more money. At the very least, industry science often leads to public confusion. Are eggs good? Are they bad? And at its worst, industry science leads unsuspecting consumers to foods that are actually bad for them, all in the name of better health. The science of industry. 299. Conflicts of interest abound in the science of industry. The CLA research was created with special interest money and has grown and been sustained with special interest money. The National Dairy Council 2022. Kraft Foods, Inc. 20. The Northeast Dairy Foods Research Center 2021. The Cattlemen's Beef Board 23 and the Cattlemen's Beef Association 23 are groups that have frequently funded these studies. Corporate influence in the academic research world can take many forms, ranging from flagrant abuses of personal power to conflicts of interest, all hidden from public view. This influence does not need to be a crass payoff to researchers to fabricate data. That sort of behavior is rare. The more significant way for corporate interests to influence academic research is much more sophisticated and effective. As illustrated by the CLA example, scientists investigate a detail out of context that can be construed as a favorable message, and industry exploits it for all it's worth. Almost no one knows where the CLA hypothesis started and who originally funded it. Few people really question such research if it is published in the best journals. Very few people, especially among the public, know which studies are benefiting from direct corporate funding. Very few people are able to sort out the technical details and recognize the missing information that would otherwise establish context. Almost everyone, however, understands that headline in my local newspaper. I could play this game, too, if I wanted to hurt the dairy industry and be a little wild in my interpretation of study results. I could produce another headline to say, new birth control chemical discovered in cows' milk. Recent research, for example, showed that CLA dramatically kills chick embryos. Point 13 Also, CLA increases the tissue level of saturated fats. That could, using our dramatic method of interpretation, exacerbate heart disease risk. Of course, I have taken these two unrelated effects grossly out of context in my example. I don't really know whether these CLA effects actually translate into less fertility and more heart disease for humans, but if I were playing the game the way industry enthusiasts do, I wouldn't mind. It would make a great headline, and that can go a long way. I recently met with one of the members of the airport club, a scientist who has been involved in the CLA effort, and he confessed that the CLA effect will never be anything more than a drug effect. However, you can bet that what is known in private will not be told in public. 300 The China Study. Industry's love of tinkering. Much of the airport club and the CLA story is a story about the dark side of science, which I detailed in chapter 13. But the CLA story is also about the dangers of reductionism, of taking details out of context and making claims about diet and health, which I discussed in the previous chapter. Like academia, industry is also an essential player in the system of scientific reductionism that undermines the knowledge we have about dietary patterns and disease. Industry, you see, loves to tinker. Securing patents based on details leads to marketing claims and, ultimately, to greater revenues. In a recent paper 20 by several CLA researchers, including Professor Dale Bauman, a longtime friend of the animal foods industry, the following sentence appeared, revealing much about how some industry enthusiasts feel as we tinker our way to health. The concept of CLA-enriched foods could be particularly appealing to people who desire a diet-based approach to cancer prevention without making radical changes in their eating habits. 20. I know that, for Bauman and others, making radical changes in eating habits means consuming a diet rich in plant-based foods. Rather than avoiding bad foods altogether, these researchers are suggesting that we tinker with the existing, but problematic, foods to correct the problem, instead of working with nature to maintain health. They want us to rely on technology, their technology. This faith in technological tinkering, in man over nature, is ever present. It is not limited to the dairy industry, or the meat industry, or the processed foods industry. It has become part of every single food and health industry in the country, from oranges to tomatoes, from cereals to vitamin supplements. The plant food industry got carried away recently when another carotenoid was discovered. You've probably heard of it. It is called lycopene, and it provides the red color in tomatoes. In 1995, it was reported that people who ate more tomatoes, including whole tomatoes and tomato-containing foods like pasta sauces, had a lower risk for prostate cancer. 24 Supporting an earlier report. Point 25. For those companies that make foods with tomato products, this was a gift from above. Marketing people in the corporate world quickly got the message. But what they zeroed in on was lycopene, not tomatoes. The Science of Industry. 301. The media, willing to oblige, rose to the occasion. It was lycopene time. Suddenly lycopene became widely known as something to eat more of. If you don't want prostate cancer. The scientific world, investigating details, escalated its efforts to decipher the lycopene magic. As of this writing, there now are 1,361 scientific publications on lycopene cited. by the National Library of Medicine. 26 A major market is developing, with trade names like lycopene low cold water dispersion and lycovit low percent to be used as food supplements. Why, judging by the health claims, we might be on the way to bringing prostate cancer, a leading cancer among men, under control. There are, though, a couple of disquieting thoughts. First, after spending millions of research and development dollars, there is some doubt whether lycopene, as an isolated chemical, can prevent prostate cancer. According to a more recent publication, 6 studies now have shown a statistically significant decrease in prostate cancer risk with increased lycopene intake. 3 non-statistically significant studies agree, and 7 studies do not show any association. 28 But these studies measured lycopene intake from whole foods, namely tomatoes. So, while these studies certainly indicate that the tomato is still a healthy food, 28 does that mean we can assume that lycopene, by itself, reduces prostate cancer risk? There are hundreds, even thousands, of chemicals in tomatoes. Do we have evidence that isolated lycopene will do what tomatoes do, especially for those who don't like tomatoes? The answer is no. 29. There is no evidence for a lycopene-specific effect on prostate cancer, and I seriously doubt whether we will ever have convincing evidence. Nonetheless, the lycopene business is up and running. In-depth studies are underway to determine the most effective dose of lycopene, as well as to determine whether commercial lycopene preparations are safe when tested in rats and rabbits. That is, 27. Also, consideration is being given to the possibility of genetically modifying plants for higher levels of lycopene and other carotenoids. 30. It is a real stretch to call this series of lycopene reports legitimate science. In my book, this is what I call technological tinkering and marketing, not science. 5 years before the latest discovery of lycopene, a graduate student of mine, Yuping He, compared 4 different carotenoids: beta-carotene, lycopene from tomatoes, canthaxanthin from carrots, and cryptoxanthin from oranges, regarding their ability to prevent cancer in experimental animals. 31. 32. Depending on what we were testing and how. 302. The China study. We did the test. Single carotenoids could have widely ranging potencies. While one carotenoid is potent in one reaction, the same carotenoid is far less potent for another reaction. This variation manifests itself in countless ways involving hundreds of antioxidants and thousands of different reactions, forming a nearly indecipherable network. Consuming one carotenoid at a time in the form of a pill will never be the same as eating the whole food, which provides the natural network of health-supporting nutrients. 5 years after our rather obscure work on these antioxidants. 32a. Harvard study 33 effectively kicked off the lycopene campaign. In my opinion, lycopene, as a cancer fighter, is headed for an already overcrowded magic bullet graveyard, leaving behind a trail of deep confusion. Fruit claims. The fruit industry plays this game just like everyone else. For example, when you think of vitamin C, what food product comes to mind? If you don't think of oranges and orange juice, you are unusual. Most of us have heard ad nauseum that oranges are a good source of vitamin C. This belief, however, is just another result of good marketing. How much do you know, for example, about vitamin C's relationship to diet and disease? Let's start with the basics. Although you probably know that oranges are a good source of vitamin C, you may be surprised to know that many other plant foods have considerably more 1 cup of peppers, strawberries, broccoli or peas all have more. 1 papaya has as much as 4 times more vitamin C than 1 orange. 34. Beyond the fact that many other foods are better sources of vitamin C, what can we say about the vitamin C that is in oranges? This concerns the ability of the vitamin to act as an antioxidant. How much of the total antioxidant activity in an orange is actually contributed by its vitamin C? Probably not more than 1_2%. 35. Furthermore, measuring antioxidant activity by using test tube studies does not represent the same vitamin C activity that takes place in our bodies. Most of our impressions about vitamin C and oranges are a mixture of conjectures and assumptions about out-of-context evidence. Who first established these assumptions? Orange merchants. Did they justify their assumptions on the basis of careful research? Of course not. Did these assumptions, presented as fact, sound good to the marketing people? Of course they did. Would I eat an orange to get my vitamin? The Science of Industry 303. C. No. Would I eat an orange because it is a healthy plant food with a complex network of chemicals that almost certainly offer health benefits? Absolutely. I played a small role in this story a couple of decades ago. In the 1970s and 1980s, I appeared in a television ad for citrus fruits. A New York public relations firm for the Florida Citrus Commission had earlier interviewed me about fruit, nutrition, and health. This interview, unknown to me at the time, was the source of my presence on the ad. I had not seen the ad and I did not get paid for it, but, nonetheless, I was one of the talking heads that helped the Florida Citrus Commission build its case for the vitamin C content of oranges. Why did I do the interview? At that point in my career, I probably thought that the vitamin C in oranges was important, and, regardless of vitamin C, oranges were very healthy foods to eat. It is very easy for scientists to get caught in the reductionism web of thinking, even if they have other intentions. It has not been until recently, after a lifetime of research, that I have come to realize how damaging it is to take details out of context and to make subsequent claims about diet and health. Industry uses these details extremely well, and the result is public confusion. Every year, it seems, some new product is being touted as the key to good health. The situation is so bad that health sections of grocery stores are often stocked more with supplements and special preparations of seemingly magic ingredients than they are with real food. Don't be tricked. The healthiest section of any store is the place where they sell whole fruits and vegetables, the produce section. Perhaps worst of all, industry corrupts scientific evidence even when its product has been linked to serious health problems. Our kids are often the most coveted targets of their marketing. The American government has passed legislation preventing cigarette and alcohol companies from marketing their products to children. Why have we ignored food? Even though it is accepted that food plays a major role in many chronic diseases, we allow food industries not only to market directly to children, but also to use our publicly funded school systems to do it. The long-term burden of our short-sighted indiscretion is incalculable. Government. Is it for the people? During the past 2 to 3 decades, we have acquired substantial evidence that most chronic diseases in America can be partially attributed to bad nutrition. Expert government panels have said it, the Surgeon General has said it, and academic scientists have said it. More people die because of the way they eat than by tobacco use, accidents, or any other lifestyle or environmental factor. We know that the incidence of obesity and diabetes is skyrocketing and that Americans' health is slipping away, and we know what to blame: diet. So shouldn't the government be leading us to better nutrition? There is nothing better the government could do that would prevent more pain and suffering in this country than telling Americans unequivocally to eat less animal products, less highly refined plant products, and more whole, plant-based foods. It is a message soundly based on the breadth and depth of scientific evidence. And the government could make this clear, as it did with cigarettes. Cigarettes kill, and so do these bad foods. But instead of doing this, the government is saying that animal products, dairy, and meat, refined sugar, and fat in your diet are good for you. The government is turning a blind eye to the evidence as well as to the millions of Americans who suffer from nutrition-related illnesses. The covenant of trust between the U.S. government and the American citizen has been broken. The United 305 306 THECHINA STU DY States government is not only failing to put out our fires, it is actively fanning the flames. Dietary ranges, the latest assault. The Food and Nutrition Board, FNB, as part of the Institute of Medicine, LAM, of the National Academy of Sciences, has the responsibility every 5 years or so to review and update the recommended consumption of individual nutrients. The FNB has been making nutrient recommendations since 1943 when it established a plan for the U.S. Armed Forces wherein it recommended daily allowances, RDAs, for each individual nutrient. In the most recent FNB report, one published in 2002, nutrient recommendations are presented as ranges instead of single numbers, as was the practice until 2002. For good health, we are now advised to consume from 45% to 65% of our calories as carbohydrates. There are ranges for fat and protein as well. A few quotes from the news release announcing this massive 900+ page report say it all. Here is the first sentence in the news release too. To meet the body's daily energy and nutritional needs while minimizing risk for chronic disease, adults should get 45% to 65% of their calories from carbohydrates, 20% to 35% from fat, and 10% to 35% from protein. Further, we find added sugars should comprise no more than 25% of total calories consumed. Added sugars are those incorporated into foods and beverages during production, and major sources include candy, soft drinks, fruit drinks, pastries, and other sweets. 2. Let's take a closer look. What are these recommendations really saying? Remember, the news release starts off by stating the report's objective of minimizing risk for chronic disease. This report says that we can consume a diet containing up to 35% of calories as fat. This is up from the 30% limit of previous reports. It also recommends that we can consume up to 35% of calories as protein. This number is far higher than the suggestion of any other responsible authority. The last recommendation puts the frosting on the cake, so to speak. We can consume up to 25% of calories as added sugars. Remember, sugars are the most refined type of carbohydrates. In effect, although government, is it for the people? 307. The report advises that we need a minimum of 45% of calories as carbohydrates. More than half of this amount, i.e., 25%, can be the sugars present in candies, soft drinks, and pastries. The critical assumption of this report is this: the American diet is not only the best there is, but you should now feel free to eat an even richer diet and still be confident that you are minimizing risk for chronic disease. Forget any words of caution you may find in this report with such a range of possibilities. Virtually any diet can be advocated as minimizing disease risk. You may have trouble getting your mind around what these figures mean in everyday terms, so I have prepared the following menu plan that supplies nutrients in accordance with these guidelines. Chart 16.L.YL. Chart 16.1, sample menu that fits into the acceptable nutrient ranges. Meal foods. Breakfast 1 cup Fruit Loop, 1 cup skim milk, 1 package M&M milk chocolate candies. Fiber and vitamin supplements. Lunch grilled cheddar cheeseburger. Dinner 3 slices pepperoni pizza, 1/16 ounces. Soda. 1 serving Archway sugar cookies. Chart 16.2, nutrient profile of sample menu plan and report recommendations. Nutrient sample menu recommended. Content ranges. Total calories minus 1,800 varies by height/weight. Protein, percent of total calories, minus 18% 10 to 35%. Fat, percent of total calories, minus 31% 20 to 35%. Carbohydrates, percent of total calories, minus 51% 45 to 65%. Sugars in sweets, or added sugars minus 23% up to 25%. Percent of total calories. Folks, I'm not kidding. This disastrous menu plan fits the recommendations of the report and is supposedly consistent with minimizing chronic disease. 308 The HENA study. What's amazing is that I could put together a variety of menus, all drenched in animal foods and added sugars, that conform to these recommended daily allowances. At this point in the book, I don't need to tell you that when we eat a diet like this day in and day out, we will be not just marching, but sprinting into the arms of chronic disease. In sad fact, this is what a large proportion of our population already does. Protein. Perhaps the most shocking figure is the upper limit on protein intake. Relative to total calorie intake, only 5 to 6% dietary protein is required to replace the protein regularly excreted by the body as amino acids. About 9 to 10% protein, however, is the amount that has been recommended for the past 50 years to be assured that most people at least get their 5 to 6% requirement. This 9 to 10% recommendation is equivalent to the well-known recommended daily allowance, or RDA.5. Almost all Americans exceed this 9 to 10% recommendation. We consume protein within the range of about 11 to 21%, with an average of about 15-16%. 6 The relatively few people consuming more than 21% protein mostly are those who pump iron, recently joined by those on high-protein diets. It is extremely puzzling that these new government-sponsored 2002 FNB recommendations now say that we should be able to consume protein up to the extraordinary level of 35% as a means of minimizing chronic diseases like cancer and heart disease. This is an unbelievable travesty, considering the scientific evidence. The evidence presented in this book shows that increasing dietary protein within the range of about 10 to 20% is associated with a broad array of health problems, especially when most of the protein is from animal sources. As reviewed earlier in this book, diets with more animal-based protein will create higher blood cholesterol levels and higher risks of atherosclerosis, cancer, osteoporosis, Alzheimer's disease, and kidney stones, to name just a few chronic diseases that the FNB committee mysteriously chooses to ignore. Furthermore, the FNB panel had the audacity to say that this 10 to 35% recommendation range is the same as previous reports. Their press release clearly states, protein intake recommendations are the same as previous reports. I know of no report that has even remotely suggested a level as high as this. When I initially saw this protein recommendation, I honestly thought, F. Government, is it for the people? 309. That it was a printing error. But, no, it was correct. I know several of the people on the panel who wrote this report and decided to give them a ring. The first panel member, a longtime acquaintance, said this was the first time he had even heard about the 35% protein limit. He suggested that this protein recommendation might have been drafted in the last days of preparing the report. He also told me that there was little discussion of the evidence on protein, for or against the high consumption level, although he recollected there being some pro-Atkins sympathy on the committee. He had not worked in the protein area, so he did not know the literature. In any event, this important recommendation slipped through the panel without much notice and made the first sentence of the FNB news release. The second panel member, a longtime friend and colleague, was a subcommittee chair during the latter part of the panel's existence. He is not a nutritional scientist and also was surprised to hear my concerns about the upper limit for protein. He did not recall much discussion on the topic either. When I reminded him of some of the evidence linking high animal protein diets to chronic disease, he initially was a little defensive, but with a little more persistence on my part about the evidence, he finally said, Colin, you know that I really don't know anything about nutrition. How, then, was he a member, let alone the chair of this important subcommittee? And it gets worse. The chair of the Standing Committee on the Evaluation of these recommendations left the panel shortly before its completion for a senior executive position in a very large food company, a company that will salivate over these new recommendations. A sugar-coated report. The recommendation on added sugar is as outrageous as the one for protein. At about the time this FNB report was being released, an expert panel put together by the WHO, World Health Organization, and the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, was completing a new report on diet, nutrition, and the prevention of chronic diseases. Professor Philip James, another friend of mine, was a member of this panel and a panel spokesperson on the added sugar recommendation. Early rumors of the report's findings indicated that the FAO was on the verge of recommending an upper safe limit of 10% for added sugar, far lower than the 25% established by the American FNB group. Politics, however, had early entered the discussion, as it had done in 310 the China study. Earlier reports on added sugars. 7 According to a news release from the Director General's office at the US, the U.S.-based Sugar Association and the World Sugar Research Organization, who represent the interests of the sugar growers and refiners, had mounted a strong lobbying campaign in an attempt to discredit the WHO One report and suppress its release. They did not like setting the upper safe limit so low. According to the Guardian newspaper of London, the US sugar industry was threatening to bring the World Health Organization to its knees unless it abandoned these guidelines on added sugar. WHO people were describing the threat as tantamount to blackmail and worse than any pressure exerted by the tobacco industry. 7 The U.S.-based group even publicly threatened to lobby the U.S. Congress to reduce the $406 million U.S. funding of the WHO if it persisted in keeping the upper limit so low at 100.10. There were reports, after a letter was sent by the industry to Secretary of Health and Human Services Tommy Thompson, that the Bush administration was inclined to side with the sugar industry. I, and many other scientists, were being encouraged at that time to contact our congressional representatives to stop this outrageous strong-armed tactic by the U.S. sugar companies. So, for added sugars, we now have two different upper safe limits, a 10% limit for the international community and a 25% limit for the U.S. Why such a huge difference? Did the sugar industry succeed in controlling the U.S.-based FNB report but fail with the HOFAO report? What does this say about the FNB scientists who also devised the new protein recommendation? These wildly different estimates are not a matter of scientific interpretation. This is nothing more than naked political muscle. Professor James and his colleagues at the WHO stood up to the pressure. The FNB group appears to have caved in. The U.S. panel received funding from the M&M Mars Candy Company and a consortium of soft drink companies. Is it possible that the U.S. group felt an obligation to these sugar companies? Incidentally, the sugar industry, in their fight against the WHO conclusion, has relied heavily on the FNB report with its 25% limit. In other words, the FNB committee produces a friendly recommendation for the sugar industry, which then turns around and uses this finding to support its claim against the WHO report. Government, is it for the people? 311. The influence of industry. This discussion still leaves unanswered the question of how industry develops such extraordinary influence. Mostly, industry develops consultancies with a few publicly visible figures in academia, who then take leadership in policy positions outside of academia. However, these industry consultants continue to wear their academic hats. They organize symposia and workshops, write commissioned reviews, chair expert policy groups and or become officers of key professional societies. They gravitate toward the leadership positions in science-based organizations that develop significant policy and publicity. Once in these positions, these people then have the opportunity to assemble teams to their liking by choosing committee members, symposia speakers, management staff, etc. The kinds of people most helpful to the team are either colleagues with similar prejudices and or colleagues who are oblivious to who is calling the shots. It's called stacking the deck, and it really works. In the case of the FNB, its panel was organized while under the chairmanship of an academic who had strong personal ties with the dairy industry. He helped in selecting the right people and helped in setting the agenda for the report, the most significant roles that anyone could have played. Is it surprising that the dairy industry, which must be ecstatic with the panel's findings, also helped to finance the report? You might be surprised to learn that academic scientists can receive personal compensation from industry while simultaneously undertaking government-sponsored activities of considerable public importance. Ironically, they can even help set the agenda for the same government authorities who have long been restricted from such corporate associations. It is a huge conflict of interest loophole allowing industries to exercise their influence through the side door of academia. In effect, the entire system is essentially under the control of industry. The government and academic communities, playing their respective roles, mostly do as they are expected to do. In addition to M&M Mars Company, the corporate sponsors of the FNB report also included major food and drug companies that would benefit from higher protein and sugar allowances. To the Dannon Institute, a leading dairy-based consortium promoting its own brand of nutrition information, and the International Life Sciences Institute, ILSI, which is a front group for about 50 food, supplement, and drug compa. 312 The China Study. Nice, both contributed funding for the FNB report. Corporate members include Coca-Cola, Taco Bell, Burger King, Nestle, Pfizer and Roche. Vitamins. 9 Some drug companies sponsored the report directly, in addition to their support through the International Life Sciences Institute. I don't recall private corporations providing financial support for the NAS expert panels that I served on. It seems as if there is no end to this story. The chair of the FNB has been an important consultant to several major dairy-related companies. Example: National Dairy Council, Mead Johnson Nutritionals, which is a major seller of dairy-based products, Nestle Company, and a Danone yogurt affiliate. 10 Simultaneously, he was chair of the Dietary Guidelines Committee that establishes the food guide pyramid and sets national nutrition policy affecting the national school lunch and breakfast programs, the food stamp program, and the women, infants, and children supplemental feeding program, WIC.I. 10 As chair of this latter committee, his personal financial associations with the food industry were not publicly revealed as required by federal law. Eventually a court order, initiated by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, 12 was required to force him and his fellow colleagues to reveal their relationships with the food industry. Although the chair's industry associations were more substantial, 6 of the 11 committee members also were shown to have ties to the dairy industry. 10. 2. The entire system of developing public nutrition information, as I originally saw with the Public Nutrition Information Committee that I once chaired, see Chapter 11, has been invaded and co-opted by industry sources that have the interest and resources to do so. They run the show. They buy a few academic hacks who have gained positions of power and who exercise considerable influence, both within academia and government. It seems curious that while government scientists are not allowed to receive personal compensation from the private sector, their colleagues in academia can receive all that they can get. In turn, these conflicted individuals then run the show in collaboration with their government counterparts. However, restricting academics from receiving corporate consultancies is not the answer. That would only drive it underground. Rather, the situation would be best handled by making one's industry connections a matter of public disclosure. Everyone needs to know the full extent of each academic's associations with the private sector. Disclosure and full transparency is in everyone's government. Is it for the people? 313. Interest. These associations should not be something we have to go to court to discover. SNLNG US back for years. Lest you think that this Food and Nutrition Board report is merely a 5-second news bite that then gets filed into a dusty old cabinet somewhere in Washington, let me assure you that tens of millions of people are directly affected by this panel's findings. According to the summary of the report itself, 13 the recommended levels of nutrient consumption that are set by this panel are the basis for nutrition labeling of foods, for the food guide pyramid, and for other nutrition education programs. They are used to determine the types and amounts of food provided in the WIC, Women, Infants, and Children, Supplemental Feeding Program, and the Child Nutrition Programs, such as school lunch, served in hospitals and nursing homes for Medicare reimbursement, found in the food supply that should be fortified with specific nutrients, used in a host of other important federal and state programs, and activities such as establishing reference values used in food labeling. 13. The school lunch program feeds 28 million children every day. With officially recommended consumption patterns like these, we are at liberty to put any agricultural commodity we want into the hungry mouths of children already suffering from unprecedented levels of obesity and diabetes. By the way, the 2002 FNB report does make one special exception. For children, it says that they can consume up to 40% of calories as fat, up from 35% for the rest of us, while minimizing the risk of chronic disease. The Women, Infants, and Children program affects the diets of another 7 million Americans, and the Medicare hospital programs feed millions of people every year. It is safe to say that the food provided by these government programs directly feeds at least 35 million Americans a month. For people who are not directly fed by the government, this nutrient information still has significant consequences. From September 2002 onwards, nutrition education programs around the country, 314 the China study, have incorporated these new guidelines. This includes education in primary schools, universities, health professional programs, and other community-based programs. Food labels also will be affected by these changes, as will the nutrition information that seeps into our lives via advertising. Almost all of the wide-ranging effects of this 2002 FNB report will be profoundly harmful. In school, our children can be fed more fat, more meat, more milk, more animal protein, and more sugar. They will also learn that this food is consistent with good health. The ramifications of this are serious, as a whole generation will walk the path of obesity, diabetes, and other chronic illnesses, all the while believing that they are doing the right thing. Meanwhile, our government and its academic hacks can feel free to unload more meat, more fat, more animal protein, and more sugar onto the neediest among us, example the women, infants, and children, WIC, participants. I consider this to be an irresponsible and callous disregard for American citizens. Of course, these women and infants are not in a position to pay for research, donate to politicians, give academics special favors, or fund government panels. For others concerned about nutrition, every time they see a dietitian, every time they see their doctor, every time they see a nutritionist, and every time they go to a community health center, they may be told that a diet high in fat, animal protein, meat, and dairy is consistent with good health, and they needn't worry about eating too many sweets. Posters that deck the bulletin boards of public institutions will now feature these new government guidelines as well. In short, this 2002 FNB report, which represents the most sweeping, regressive nutrition policy statement I have ever seen, will either indirectly or directly promote sickness among Americans for many years to come. Having been a member of several diet and health policy making expert panels over a 20-year period, I harbored the view that these panels were dedicated to the promotion of consumer health. I no longer believe this to be true. Unfunded nutrition. Not only is the government failing to promote health through its recommendations and reports, it is squandering an opportunity to promote public health through scientific research. The U.S. National Institutes of Health, NIH, is responsible for funding at least 80 to 90% of all biomedical and nutrition-related research that is published in the scientific government, it for the people. 315. Literature. To address various health topics, The NIH is comprised of 27 separate institutes and centers, including its two largest, the National Cancer Institute, NCO, and the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute. L4 with a proposed 2005 budget of almost $29 billion, 15. The NIH is the center of the government's gigantic medical research efforts. In terms of nutrition research, however, something is amiss. None of these 27 institutes and centers at the NIH is devoted to nutrition, despite the pivotal nature of nutrition in health, and despite the public interest in the subject. One of the arguments against having a separate institute for nutrition is that the existing institutes already concern themselves with nutrition. But this does not happen. Chart 16.3 shows the funding priorities for various health topics at the NIH. L6. Of the $28 billion NIH budget proposed for 2004, only about 3.6% is designated for projects that are related in some way to nutrition. L7 and 24% for projects that are related to prevention. That may not sound too bad, but these figures are seriously misleading. Most of the prevention and nutrition budgets have absolutely nothing to do with prevention and nutrition, as I have written in this book. Chart 16.3, NIH 2004 estimated funding for different health topics. 316. The China study. We won't be hearing about exciting research on dietary patterns, nor will there be serious efforts to tell the public how diet affects health. Instead, the prevention and nutrition budgets will be designated for developing drugs and nutrient supplements. A few years ago, the director of the NC, the oldest of the NIH institutes, described prevention as efforts to directly prevent and/or inhibit malignant transformation, to identify, characterize, and manipulate factors that might be effective in achieving that inhibition and attempts to promote preventative measures. 18. This so-called prevention is all about manipulation of isolated chemicals. Identifying, characterizing, and manipulating factors is a not-so-secret code for drug discovery. Considered from another perspective, the NCI of the NIH, in 1999, had a budget of $2.93 billion. 19. In a major 5-a-day dietary program, it was spending $500,000 to $1 million to educate the public to consume 5 or more servings of fruits and vegetables per day. 18. This is only 0.03%, 0.0256% of its budget. That's $2.56 for every $100,000. If it calls this a major campaign, I pity its minor campaigns. The NCI also has been funding a couple of multi-year large studies, including the Nurses' Health Study at Harvard, discussed in Chapter 12, and the Women's Health Initiative, mostly devoted to the testing of hormone replacement therapy, vitamin D, and calcium supplementation, and the effect of a moderately low-fat diet on prevention of breast and colon cancer. These rare nutrition-related studies, unfortunately, suffer from the same experimental flaws described in Chapter 14. Almost always, these studies are designed to tinker with one nutrient at a time, among an experimental population that uniformly consumes a high-risk, animal-based diet. These studies have a very high probability of creating some very expensive confusion that we hardly need. If very few of our tax dollars are used to fund nutrition research, what do they fund? Almost all of the billions of dollars of taxpayer money expended by the NIH each year funds projects to develop drugs, supplements, and mechanical devices. In essence, the vast bulk of biomedical research funded by you and me is basic research to discover products that the pharmaceutical industry can develop and market. In 2000, Dr. Marcia Angel, a former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, summarized it well when she wrote to Degree. The pharmaceutical industry enjoys extraordinary government protections and subsidies. Much of the early basic research that government, is it for the people? 317. May lead to drug development is funded by the National Institutes of Health, Rev. Cited. It is usually only later, when the research shows practical promise, that the drug companies become involved. The industry also enjoys great tax advantages. Not only are its research and development costs deductible, but so are its massive marketing expenses. The average tax rate of major U.S. industries from 1993 to 1996 was 27.3% of revenues. During the same period, the pharmaceutical industry was reportedly taxed at a rate of only 16.2%, Rev. Cited. Most important, the drug companies enjoy 17-year government-granted monopolies on their new drugs, that is, patent protection. Once a drug is patented, no one else may sell it, and the drug company is free to charge whatever the traffic will bear. 20. Our tax dollars are used to make the pharmaceutical industry more profitable. One could argue that this is justified by gains in public health, but the alarming fact is that this litany of research into drugs, genes, devices, and technology research will never cure our chronic diseases. Our chronic diseases are largely the result of infinitely complex assaults on our bodies resulting from eating bad food. No single chemical intervention will ever equal the power of consuming the healthiest food. In addition, isolated chemicals in drug form can be very dangerous. The National Cancer Institute itself states, "What is clear is that most of our current treatments will produce some measure of adversity." 21. There is no danger to eating a healthy diet, and there are far more benefits, including massive cost savings both on the front end of preventing disease and on the back end of treating disease. So why is our government ignoring the abundant scientific research supporting a dietary approach in favor of largely ineffective, potentially dangerous drug and device interventions? Personal accounts. In terms of public nutrition policy, I want to leave you with one short story that says so much about the government's priorities. One of my former graduate students at Cornell, Antonia Demas, now Dr. Antonia Demas, did her doctoral research in education by teaching a healthy food and nutrition-based curriculum 22 to elementary school kids and then integrating those healthy foods into the school lunch program. She had been doing this work as a volunteer mother in her children's schools for 17